Hi everybody, I'm Stuart Hillard from AccuQuilt and I want to welcome you to today's quilting classroom. And today's quilting classroom is all about borders on quilts. Now, can you imagine a beautiful painting without a frame? It would still be beautiful, but the visual reference that contains all that loveliness is gone. Adding borders, adding frames to quilts can really finish off our work and make our quilts so much more than the piecing. So in today's class, I'm going to be showing you how to measure and cut simple plain borders. I'm also going to be telling you and showing you how to make pieced borders and how to make a quilt that's entirely borders. And I'm also going to be showing you some of the great applique dies that AccuQuilt do, which can add a load of impact to your quilts. And you'll see some of those in today's quilting classroom. So the first thing that I want to do really is have a look at a quilt that has just plain simple borders on to show you the sort of impact that putting those borders on has. So I've got this quilt here, which is called the Christmas Cactus quilt. And this is using the cube and the New Angles Companion. It was really fun to piece and I had a great time making the center of this quilt. But when I'd finished it, I realized that it really needed some frames to focus attention in on the piecing and to create a focal point. So I love to put double borders on quilts. I think it goes back to my time when I was a primary school teacher and I would double mount the children's artwork. We always used to say that double mounting any piece of artwork always made it look more special and created more impact. So I do that a lot with my quilts. So on this one, I've put just simple borders. I've got a 2-inch finished border in red, and I've followed that up with a 3-inch finished border in green. And I've also included cornerstones. They're these contrasting squares at the corners, which again, for me, help to anchor the quilt and provide some focus at each of the corners. It draws attention outwards so that when people look at the quilt, they look at the whole thing and get a really good view of the entire quilt. Now, when you add borders to a quilt, I suppose most of us think of adding simple plain borders as the easiest way to add a border to a quilt. Now, I always say that there's a right way of adding borders, there's a wrong way, and there's a very wrong way of adding borders. And I don't normally like to talk about the negatives, but when it comes to borders, I think it's worth pointing out the very wrong way of adding borders, because in all honesty, it's the way that most of us put our borders onto our quilts, and it creates problems. And I'm going to talk about the very wrong way of doing it. The very wrong way of adding borders is to cut your strips of fabric for your borders and cut them extra long. So maybe the quilt is 50.5 inches in length. So we cut our border strips at maybe 55 inches. We put them raw edge to raw edge and we sew our seam and we just leave extra hanging off at either end. We press our border back and then we put everything down onto a rotary cutter and put our ruler on top and we trim off the extra at either side. That's the very wrong way of adding borders. Why is it so tempting to do it that way? Well, it's the easiest way, isn't it? You don't have to measure anything, and once you've chopped off the ends, your border appears to fit perfectly. The reason why that's not a great idea to do is because the outside edges of units, blocks and quilts have a tendency to stretch and bow outwards. And if we add borders on and just trim the edges, everything is migrating outwards and bowing outwards. And then you end up with that quilt that doesn't lie flat, that doesn't hang straight, and that has rippled or ruffled edges. And we've all seen those quilts, and I've certainly made a few of them in my time too, but not anymore. Because now when I put my borders on my quilts, I put them on the right way, and I'm going to talk to you about the right way of putting your borders on. So the first thing that you'll need to do is to measure your quilt top. So I'm just going to lay this flat for a moment. So obviously this is a finished quilt, but I want you to go back a step or two to when this was just the pieced centre and I'd stitched everything together. Now, of course, all things being equal, if my cutting is perfect, well, with AccuQuilt, my cuts are always perfect. If my piecing is perfect, well, I do my best. But, you know, sometimes my seams may be a fraction over or under. So I can't always rely on the mathematical finished size of my quilt top. But I like to keep that in mind because that's what I'm aiming for. And I'm always trying to make sure that my quilt tops are as close to mathematical perfection as I can get them. So with that figure in mind, I'm then going to measure my quilt top. Now, the wrong way of measuring your quilt top would be to measure along the outside edges. Why is that the wrong way? Well, for the same reason that sewing on long borders and chopping off the ends is the very wrong way, your quilt top will probably bow slightly wider at the outside edges. So again, if we use that as our true measurement, again our quilt is sort of splaying outwards. So to avoid that, we're actually going to measure through the centre of our quilt. On a quilt of this size, this is about 45 inches square, taking one measurement through the centre is enough. If your quilt's bigger, maybe it's queen size, maybe it's king size, or even bigger, then I'm going to take multiple measurements. So I might take a measurement a quarter of the way in, and halfway, and then 3/4. So I'll take 3 separate measurements. I'll then add those 3 measurements together, and then I'll find the average. And to do that, because I took 3 measurements, I'm going to divide the total by 3. If you take 5 measurements, divide the total by 5. And whatever average length you come up with, that's the measurement that you want to cut your borders to. So that way, we're going to keep everything square and true on our quilt top. A couple of other things that are going to help you fit those borders to your quilt with ease. The first thing is that when you've cut your border, you want to fold it in half and press the centre. Just finger press it. If you start ironing fabric and putting an ironed crease in, fabric has a memory, and if you treat it bad, it will remember and it will hold it against you. So that crease can be very hard to remove. So just a light finger press, or even just put a pin at the centre, and then fold the outer edges in towards that centre, and again place a pin or a finger crease. So we've divided our border up into quarters. Do exactly the same with your quilt top. Find the centre and find the 1/4 and 3/4 marks, and then you can match up those 3 positions and pin the border to your top. Then last of all, pin the start and the finish of your border in line with your quilt top, and then pin through. If you've any fullness in either the top or the border, then you can ease that in very gently. And if you have had to ease any in and there's slight fullness, make sure when you sew that you have that fullness down against your feed dogs. As we say in the sewing world, always sew with a baggy bottom. So that's our very right way of sewing on plain, simple borders. Let's cut some. Now when you cut your borders, if you try doing it with a ruler and chalk and a pair of scissors, good luck keeping those pieces straight. If you use a rotary cutter and a ruler, again, one of the classic issues is that ruler wobbles, or we wobble, and everything moves. And our strip that was meant to be 3.5 inches from start to finish starts 3.5 inches and ends at 3 3/8 or 3 7/8. And that is not going to help you to create a quilt which is straight and square and true. The secret to really perfect borders is, of course, to AccuQuilt them. And we have a whole range of different strip dies that are going to allow you to cut those borders beautifully and accurately every single time. Now I've got my absolute favourite and my essential out on the table ready, and that's my 2.5 inch strip die. So vertical blades that run from top to bottom on our board, but no blades at the top, no blades at the bottom. This means that we can cut a continuous length of well over 120 inches in one continuous length. Now the biggest quilt I've ever made was 124 inches, and I could cut with my dies in one continuous length. So even those really super king size quilt borders you can cut quickly and easily. So let me show you how to get your fabric onto your die first of all. Now you can see that we've got straight lines here, 90-degree lines at the top and the bottom. These are really important to help solve the other issue when we're trying to rotary cut strips. And that is, we cut the strip on the fold, and then when we open that strip up, where it's folded, we end up with a V shape or a little elbow or a bump in our strip. So rather than being perfectly straight, it has a slight V shape to it, or a big V shape to it sometimes. I'm going to show you how to avoid that completely. So I've got my fabric. This is fabric straight off the bolt. So this is approximately 44 inches in width. And I've got it selvage to selvage. Now normally when we're cutting with our AccuQuilt dies, we want to make sure that the lengthwise grain goes through the length of the machine and runs north to south. However, when you're cutting your strips, it's okay if you have that straight of grain, that lengthwise grain running crosswise. You're still going to get beautiful accurate cuts, and it's a more economical way of buying and using fabric. So I've got my fabric pressed, and I've got it pressed in half. So I've got my fold, and I've got my fold at the top of my fabric. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to line the fold of my fabric against the top line on the die. So I've got a black line that runs across the top of my die, and I'm just maybe 1/8 of an inch back from that, and I've got that fold perfectly in line right from one side to the other. Now this is the bit that's super important to keep your strips straight when you open them out. It's having that fold lined up. If you have your fold slightly at an angle, like I've now placed it, when you open those strips up, they're going to have that characteristic V shape to them. Although the strips themselves will be straight, they won't go straight from one side to the other. So make sure that you keep that fold perfectly in line with that black line at the top. Now possibly you may need to fold your fabric up at the bottom. It depends how wide your fabric is, and if you were doing a continuous length for a really long border for a quilt, we would fold our fabric against this line here, and again make sure that line is straight. And we can keep fan folding 2 layers, 4 layers, 6 layers, up to 6 layers. All right, so again make sure that both of those folds are perfectly flat, and then the last thing that we're going to do is put our cutting mat on top. Okay, we're ready to cut. So I'll pop that to one side, and I've got my Go Big. My Go Big is now my absolute go-to machine for all of my quilt cutting. I have a Go Baby and a Go 2, and I do still use them all the time, but I love my Go Electric. It's so quick, so easy, and I don't have to hand crank. So also, because I've got that extra wide mouth, if there's any extra fabric, I can just make sure it's tucked inside, but I don't necessarily have to trim it off. And then offer it up, and let your Go Cutter do the work for you. So that's going to cut my strips, and these are 2.5-inch strips. Now, of course, they're great for borders, they're great for sashings, but they're also fantastic for binding our quilts with another time when we need those long straight strips. Now, when your die comes out of your machine, just make sure that you slide the mat off rather than lifting it off. And that's just because of that little bit of static electricity which can pull your strips away. It doesn't do them any harm, but it can just pull them off the board. And there we've got perfect 2.5-inch strips. So if we want to eke out a strip roll that we've bought, or we want to make our own strip roll using our scraps or yardage, we can. If we want to add borders, we can. And of course, this is perfect for bindings as well. So we've got our 2.5-inch strips all cut, and this would make a great border on its own. But I also like to cut wider borders to go with my narrower borders, so I can do that double frame. So for that, I like to use one of the wider dies. Now here, I've got the 4.5-inch cut, 4-inch finished die. This is a great size for wall hangings and for quilts, and works particularly well, I think, when done as a double border mixed with a 2-inch wide finish border. So this cuts 2 strips at a time, and this will go through your Go or your Go Big. So I'm going to cut some strips out of this as well. Now, another way of easily adding some impact to your quilts, to your quilt borders, is rather than just using a plain fabric or a solid fabric or even a pattern fabric, is to use a stripe. I think striped borders always look incredible and add loads of impact. So I've got this fantastic striped fabric, it's almost like a deck chair stripe. And I'm just going to cut 2 layers this time. I've let the rest of my fabric hang off the side, and I'm just going to tuck it in out of the way, and again pass that through my Go Big. So this is using the 4.5-inch strip die, and that gives me a 4-inch finished border. Now, in terms of proportions when you're cutting borders for your quilts, I like to use borders which are going to have a synergy with the actual quilt top itself and with the piecing. So as a general rule of thumb, I like to start with whatever cube I'm using, if I'm using a cube for my quilt. So say, for example, I'm using the 12-inch cube and my blocks are 12-inch finished. I like to use borders which will divide into 12. So 2 works well, 3 is good, 4 is good, 6 is good. All of those finished sizes of border will look great with 12-inch blocks. They have a natural affinity and a natural fit because the maths works. All of the blocks, all of the cubes that AccuQuilt do have border dies or strip dies that will match up to them. So for example, the 3.5-inch strip die will work beautifully with your 6-inch cube. There is a 4-inch finished strip die, the one I'm just using, which works perfectly well with your 8-inch cube. There's a 4.5-inch finished 5-inch cut, which works beautifully with the 9-inch cube. And then there's the 6-inch finished, which is great for adding borders on the 12-inch cube. It's great to have a selection of them, and if you can only have 2 strip dies, then I would recommend you have half the width of your cube and 1/4 of the width of your cube, and then they will always work beautifully for sashings, borders, double borders, whatever you want to do with them. And of course, don't forget that 2.5-inch strip die for your bindings. So I've cut my 4-inch finished strips here now, and I just want to show you how these will look great together when I put them around my quilt top. So I've got my 4-inch finished border, and then I'm just going to grab one of the 2-inch finished borders, and this will look really good sewn together to make a double border for my quilt. If I wanted a wider border, of course, I could always add a second border of the cream fabric on top, and now my border will finish at 8 inches wide. So there's some really nice options for adding simple pieced borders or simple plain borders to your quilt. So either have one border on its own, thick or thin, add a double or a triple border. Now, one other thing that I love using my strip dies for borders is to cut cornerstones. And remember that the cornerstones are those squares at the corners of the border. You don't have to put them in. You can have your borders that go straight off the sides. But for me, if I can add a bit more visual interest to my borders by adding cornerstones, I will, even if they're in a toning or a similar colour. Now I can still use my strip die to do that, and I'll show you how I cut some cornerstones to go with this lovely striped border. So I'm going to grab a different blue, and I think I'm going to go with a solid blue. I think this will work really well. So what I'm going to do first of all is cut some more strips. Now maybe sometimes you just want to cut one strip at 4.5 inches wide, and this is a perfect example. I don't cover the whole die. All I'm going to do is cover one of the strips, and I'll let it hang over the blade by maybe 1/4 inch. Also, I don't want to cut a whole long strip. I only need a short piece. So again, I can just lay my fabric on one end of the die. So I'm going to pop the mat on top and open up my Go Big so that we're ready to cut. And then I'll pass this through. And again, any extra fabric, I'm just going to make sure is tucked in out of the way so that it doesn't catch. Just be ready to get it when it comes out the other side. Does it great every time. So I've got my 4.5 inch strip cut now, and I doubled that up. So then what I can do is lay this straight across the die, and I'm just going to use the 90-degree line at the top as my reference point, and I'm going to make sure that I line my 4.5 inch strip up perfectly with that 90-degree line. I'm going to lay the mat back on top, and I'm going to recut that strip. So I can lay out my border now. There we go. And so by laying my strip in the opposite direction, what I've now cut are perfect 4.5 inch squares, or whatever size strip die you've got. So if you've got the 6.5 inch strip die, you could cut perfect 6.5 inch squares, and they would make a beautiful quilt all on their own, of course. But they're great for cornerstones. So here I've got my stripy border. And I'll just close up my Go Big for a second so I can show you how now we can add cornerstones to my quilt. And then when I add that second border going around, and I always like to lay out my pieces just as I am now so that I can get a good visual on how the border is going to look. And that for me gives me a lot more impact. Having that cornerstone, it draws attention out towards the corner, and it really sort of emphasizes this is a frame, this is containing my work. If you use a lot of scraps or make a lot of scrap quilts, having strong anchor points at the corners can really help to sort of contain the chaos and make some order out of it and turn your multitude of scraps into something really visually beautiful. That's where borders can really come into their own. So that's how we're going to do simple borders, and we've measured our quilt accurately and found the average measurement, and then all we need to do is measure those strips and cut them either with a pair of scissors or a rotary cutter to the right length, and then you're good to go. So that's simple plain borders that are anything but plain. Now next I want to show you how you can use your cube to create pieced borders for your quilts. Now I want to show you this quilt that's hanging right next to me, and this is a picnic quilt that I've just finished making, ready for the summer. And what I've done here is I've made a real virtue out of pieced borders and plain borders to make a whole quilt in borders. This is what we call a frame quilt. So I've started off with this center square, and I've added a simple plain border around that, and then I've created pieced borders and some plain borders to go around it as a way of using up my scraps, but also as a way of creating a beautiful quilt that isn't based on blocks, that's based on borders instead. So you can see here I've used a checkerboard border. Right next to it we've got a half square triangle border, and you can see there those cornerstones that help anchor the borders in place. We've got a couple of plain borders. This one has no cornerstone, so it just creates a nice subtle frame, but the next border going out has another cornerstone because again I want to draw attention to this part of the quilt. That final border around the outside is what we call a piano key border, using rectangles, again with cornerstones. The other benefit of using cornerstones on the borders of your quilts is it's a really nice, easy way to turn a corner. If you don't have cornerstones, there's always the dilemma of what happens when two triangles meet or don't meet where you want them to. So adding cornerstones can help avoid that issue. So if you have a look on our website, you'll see 13 of my favorite pieced borders that I've given you the patterns for, that you can use to mix and match and create your own frame quilt or to use in your quilt. But let me show you how easy some of them are to cut and piece using your AccuQuilt system and your cube. Now when we talk about the cube, we often talk about the blocks. We talk about the 12-inch cube making 12-inch blocks, but of course there's so much more that you can do with your cube than just making blocks, and pieced borders are a perfect example. So let's start out with die number 2, which is just a simple small square. And I've got my 6x6 cutting mat. This is a great time to dig into your stash. I'm going to grab some fabrics and layer them up. We can go up to 6 layers of fabric. So I'm going to put 6 layers, and we'll make a cut. And then I'm also going to cut a few more. So if you've got charm squares and you don't know what to do with them, using them to make a pieced border is a great plan. Let's cut 4 more. Always making sure that you've got the lengthwise grain going through the length of your machine. Just make sure that the selvage is on the left or the right, or you can always do the snap test that I showed you in the first video. So then, to create a lovely checkerboard border, we're just going to lay out our squares that we've cut. And the easiest way to sew these is to sew them first of all as a 4 patch. So sew those 2 squares together, sew the next 2 squares together, and then join them, making sure you match that center carefully to create a 4 patch. Once you've done that, you can add your next 4 patch and so on to create a checkerboard border. There's no reason, of course, why it has to be 2 layers. It could just be 1. It could be 3. And one of the great benefits of having an AccuQuilt system and being able to cut your fabric so quickly and easily is that you can make these design decisions as you go. You don't have to have a plan. It's quick and easy to cut some extra shapes and see how would it look if I did a triple border. Yeah, I like that more. So I'm going to stick with a triple border. So a checkerboard border is one of my favorites. Now I'll move those out of the way for a second, and I'm going to use the rectangle die from my cube. So I've got that right here. And the rectangle die is the one that I used for my piano keyboard. So we'll cut a few shapes using the rectangle. So again, we can go up to 6 layers, just fan folding your fabric back and forth over your die. And then you'll need your 10 by 10 cutting mat. Pop that on top and we'll let that run through the machine. Now I love the fact that my Go Electric is doing the cutting for me while I'm having a tidy up or grabbing some other dies or some other shapes that I've cut, and then I can start having a play with my shapes. So here I've got some rectangles that I've cut. So on my quilt that you saw on the wall, I've used rectangles that are all the same colour. I've used reds or reds and pinks. But here I'm going to use some different colours, and rather than just a dark, light, I'm going to go light, medium, dark, light, medium and dark. And then I can keep that going around my quilt. And that's a great way of bringing the colours from your quilt into your border. So use some of the fabrics that you've used in the centre of your quilt to create that pieced border. Once you've created that pieced border, if you need more, then of course you can always add a wider border to the bottom, or possibly a narrow and a wider border. So now we've created almost like a picket fence effect, and this gives so much more impact to the borders. Now, one of the reasons why lots of us avoid pieced borders is because we can't do a pieced border the very wrong way. And you remember how I described the very wrong way of putting a border as cutting a long strip of fabric, stitching it on and then chopping the ends off to make it fit? Well, of course, we can't do that with a pieced border. We can't chop the ends up. We'll chop off part of our piecing. And I think that's why lots of us think they're difficult to use in a quilt. But in actual fact, a pieced border is a more accurate border to add, because we usually have reference points on our quilt. If you have a look on this quilt here, I've got my checkerboard border, and when I came to add my next border to it, which was half square triangles, because I've used the same cube, the square and the triangle unit finish at the same size. So when I'm adding this border, I have all these reference points to help me pin that border in place so that the fit is perfect. And even where I've got 2 units attached to a square, I can fold that square in half and find the center, and that's going to meet with the center point of these 2 triangles. So actually, I think pieced borders are often an easier way of adding a border, but we do not have the option of chopping off the ends to make it fit. But that's quite good. I think it disciplines us a little bit more to be more accurate in our sewing. Our cutting is going to be perfect. So there's my piano keyboard, and I've added extra borders to create some more impact. Now I could use some of those squares that I used for my checkerboard to add to this to create another border. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding a square to every rectangle, and then every other rectangle I'm dropping down. And so on and so forth. And that creates a totally different border. So this is using die number 2 for your squares and die number 8 for your rectangles. And again, we have this wonderful movement through the border, and this would be great to add some curved quilting to, or some feathers when we're quilting. So that's another really easy border. And piecing it is as simple as sewing a square to a rectangle and then joining those strips up. Super easy, and it's going to add so much more impact to your quilt than always adding a simple straight border. Let's do another one. And this is great fun to do if you've got a bunch of scraps, to cut up lots of different shapes and just have a go at trying out different borders. Now here I've got some half square triangles that I've cut, and I've cut these half square triangles using die number 5. So this is the small half square triangle from your cube. And remember, it doesn't matter whether you've got the 6, the 8, the 9 or the 12-inch cube, those numbers are the same. Those proportions are the same, so you can make every single one of these pieced borders using any sized cube. And it's actually really fun to mix and match them within a quilt as well. So adding the 6-inch cube and the 12-inch cube together in your piecing for your blocks, but also for your borders, adds real dynamism to a quilt. So I've got my half square triangles all cut out. So we could start out with just a very simple sawtooth border. So I'm going to start by setting out my half square triangles, and I've got some cut out in darks, and then I've got the same shape, that die number 5, the half square triangle, cut out in lights. Quite often when I'm doing a scrappy quilt, I will keep one element consistent. So my background fabric might be all the same. And then my other focus fabric, I will mix up and use lots of different scraps. But this would also look terrific. Just divide your fabrics into half lights, half darks, and create that sawtooth border. Now, if one looks great, 2 is bound to look even better, isn't it? So let's do a second row of sawtooth triangles, and I'm just going to drop this one down. In fact, I'll drop that one down so I don't have 2 of the same in the row. And now I've got a double sawtooth border. Now, of course, you could, when you get halfway across your quilt, you could change the direction of these half square triangles. So they're going to meet together in the center and create the flying goose. And then the border will change direction. And that will create a different border, different visual interest. And again, don't forget, we can always add more impact to this by adding a straight border or a plain border, top and bottom, to frame it, or even create something like a striped border like this, top and bottom. So really mix up your straight strip dies with your piecing. So there's some great effects that we can get with the half square triangle. Double rows, single rows, triple rows. You can keep going. Let's use some of these half square triangles combined with some of the rectangles. So we used rectangles in our last border. How about if we have a rectangle and we top it with a half square triangle unit? Now we have a long chisel shape, but it's got a scrappy look to it. Let's put our next rectangle against it. Another half square triangle on top, and we'll keep repeating this. So let's grab some more rectangles, and we could alternate the colours here. And again, maybe sometimes even use the same fabric at the top, and then sometimes not. If you choose fabrics that have a similar tone, from a distance you will get that overall effect, you will get that picket fence, and I think that really does look like a picket fence border. But when you get close up, you'll see that it's actually scrappy, and I think particularly when you look down on that, you can really see that visual effect. Of course, there's no reason why you shouldn't add a second row of triangles, and I think we could have them going this way, and I'll just add a couple more so that you can see the effect. So just by changing one element, we've got a completely different quilt block or border that's going to add a different look to our quilt. So now we've got another look, and I think particularly effective when you use a variety of scraps. So that's just using die number 8, your rectangle, and die number 5, which is your small half square triangle. Don't forget that any border that you can do using the small half square triangle, you can also do a larger version using die number 3, which is your large half square triangle. The proportions are going to be twice as big. So that's using a couple of different dies together. Now I've also got some large half square triangles here, and I'm going to show you another really fun border. And this is combining those large half square triangles combined with some small half square triangles. So I'm going to grab a few small half square triangles, and then I'm going to fill in the gaps. And often when I'm playing around with patches to create new borders, I like to lay out the bones, the skeleton first of all. So I'll lay out the feature fabric to show me where I'm going, and then filling in the background is really easy because the background suddenly pops. It's what's left behind. So sometimes when you're scratching your head trying to work out which bit goes where, it's easier just to lay out those bare bones, and then you've got that border. And that again I think is a really lovely impactful border, very, very easy to sew. All you're going to do is split this apart into sections. So you're going to sew your half square triangle first of all, light and dark together. So just flip it right sides together and sew your 1/4 inch seam and open it out. And then you're going to add a half square triangle here and here to create a large triangle. Now once that's sewn together, it's a really good thing just as a visual to lay your unpieced triangle on top of it and make sure that the two triangles fit perfectly. That tells us that all of your seam allowances have been sewn really accurately. Do that every now and then just as a reminder to, sew accurately. And if you're starting to maybe sew your seam allowance a little bit too big, it just reins you in and reminds you before you sew 150 of them and then find that you're struggling to fit them together. Sew a few, do that visual check of laying the unpieced onto the pieced, and if they both fit, you're in business, keep going. So this is a border I call hen and chickens because we've got the hen and we've got her chicks next to her. And again, of course, we can vary the placement, we can put those together and we can create a different border using exactly the same units. Now while we're looking at those, of course, no pieced border tutorial would be complete without talking about flying geese, and they're one of my favourite border treatments when I'm doing a pieced border. I love flying geese units and they make such brilliant borders. So using die number 4, which is your 1/4 square triangle, and then die number 5, which is your half square triangles, to finish off the flying geese. And this really does create that sort of image of a skein of geese flying through the sky when they're migrating for the winter. And this always looks great on a border. Of course, don't forget that any of these that I'm talking about as borders would also make fantastic pieced sashing. So particularly if your piecing in your blocks is quite simple, or maybe you've done applique blocks, to have some piecing in the sashings or the cornerstones looks really good. And just to give you a visual reference to that, if we just go back to this quilt that's hanging on the wall, here where I've used a plain cornerstone in the corner, I could have had plain blocks and then had my piecing actually in the corner, and that would also look great. So we could have just some simple piecing at the corners and plain borders in the middle. So it really is worth playing around with your cube and your strip dies to create some different visual effects. And if you have a look on our website, as I mentioned, I've put my 13 favourites on there for you to try. Now before we move on, I just want to show you one more pieced border that's slightly different, and that's using the trapezoid shape from the cube. Now the trapezoid shape, and this is it right here, this is the one that we might use to make something like a Lemoyne star. This kind of effect. All right, we've all seen a Lemoyne star. Okay, there's one half of it. But we can also use this shape to create a really fantastic border. But there's something that we need to be aware of, and that is that the trapezoid is not symmetrical. So when you're cutting, if you fan fold your fabric, right side up, right side down, right side up, right side down, as we do for most of our cutting, you're going to end up with half of your pieces cut left-handed and half of your pieces cut right-handed. That's great if you want an even mixture of left and right. But let's say, for example, we wanted to create a border which had that left and right. Let's see if I can find the other piece now. There we go. So, great, perfect. One left, one right, one left, one right. But of course, for this border, we need all of our darks to be left facing and all of our mediums to be right facing. So to do that, what we need to do is stack our fabrics all right side facing up or all wrong side facing up to create those lefts and rights. So just keep that in mind if you're going to use the trapezoids for a border, but it really does create a fantastic border, and there's all kinds of things you can do with that too. So that's a little look at pieced borders. Now what I want to do is have a look at some of the fantastic applique borders that we do at AccuQuilt and show you how to get the best out of them. Now, I love plain borders, I love pieced borders, but I really love applique borders, and AccuQuilt have created some fantastic dies for creating gorgeous applique borders. One of my favourites, it's one of my new favourites, is this one right here, which is the scallop border. Now, it's a two-part scallop. We've got the main scallop right here, which you can, of course, use on its own, and then we've also got the scalloped edge, which lays over the top of the plain scallop. Now, if you have a look at this quilt right here, I've done a pineapple log cabin, and then I've created a swag border all the way around the outside edges, which has elevated this quilt from something which I thought was lovely to something now which I think has got real visual appeal. It's really brought it all together, and it was so easy to do. The swags here are just fusible applique, so iron your fusible web to the back of your fabrics first, then cut them, peel the paper away and position them and fuse them down. Now, what I was able to do here, the swag finishes at 12 inches long. My blocks are 15 inches finished. So it was very easy just to measure in 1.5 inches and 1.5 inches from the ends and place that swag and fuse it down. It's also really important to make sure that you maintain a consistent distance from the outer edge of your border all the time as well. Make sure you leave enough room for your binding, plus a little more at the very least. Okay, but then there are gaps in the middle. So if you're not creating a swag border for a quilt that's 12-inch blocks, you need something to go in the middle. Now, what I used there was shapes from Edita Sitar's Simple Shapes die. I used 2 different sizes of leaf and 2 different sizes of circle and appliqued those to create this connection between the swags, and it was very easy to do, and it really just sort of came together. I cut the pieces and arranged them until I was happy, and once I was happy with them, fused them down and sewed. So that's the swag border, one of my favorites, and that's on a 6-inch finished border. So I used my 6-inch finished strip die to cut the borders and also the cornerstones. You can see there, even though the corners are tan like the borders, I've cut them separately because, again, I like to just create a little bit of extra visual interest at the corners. Now, next up, I've got the scallop border. This is another really fun border die. I'm going to cut this one out from this lovely striped fabric again to show you what a great effect this can create. So I'm just going to trim my fabric down a little bit. Just a little bit more. I just want to cut one simple piece of scalloped border. Now, with the scallop border, your blades run in an arc, a series of arcs like this down the die, but there's no blade at the bottom or over here either. Now that is fantastic, and I'll show you why it's so brilliant. So let's put the fabric on top and cut. So the first thing that's fantastic about this die is that we're getting two different borders for the price of one, because we've got the scallop, but we've also got the negative scallop that's left behind when we cut. So here's the fantastic scalloped border that you can see right there. I just think that's wonderful and would create such a great border appliqued round a quilt. But we've also got the negative here, which also makes a terrific border on its own. We could cut these out of two different fabrics. We can leave a gap between the two, and because they're so precisely cut, everything's going to match up. Or we could cut them in two different fabrics and then push those two layers together to create another kind of border. Now the fact that we have no cuts running down means that once we've cut our scallop, we're able then to decide how wide do we want this scallop border to be. Do we want it to be 2 inches wide? Do we want it to be 3? Do we want it to be 5 inches wide? So we can customize this border to any width that we want, and we can do that with both the positive and the negative. So I think that's a great border die. The last one that I'm going to show you is the Rickrack die. So the Rickrack die I've used here not as a border, but actually as a block. So this die cuts a 4-inch finished Rickrack, that's the one in the centre, and a 2-inch Rickrack, that's the ones either side. So of course we can use it to piece this block, applique onto large 10-inch squares using my 10-inch square die, and then stitch down. Lovely. But it's also terrific for sashings and borders. Now then, let's just cut a simple Rickrack. So we'll lay the fabric on top, mat on top of that. This will go through the Go Baby and the Go Big, so this is compatible with all machines. If you only wanted to cut the 2-inch wide Rickrack, well, then you just cover that section of the die with fabric, cover the whole thing with your cutting mat, and then just cut the 2-inch Rickrack. So it's a very, very versatile die. So we'll slide that mat off, and what's left behind is our Rickrack, and we have got our 2-inch finished Rickrack right there, and then we've got our 4-inch finished Rickrack right there. And again, we can use them together, we can use them apart, we can nest them back together with different fabrics. There's so many different effects. But one of the questions I get asked all the time is, can I use this Rickrack die to create a longer piece of Rickrack than the length of my die board? What if I want to create a Rickrack border on a 50-inch square quilt? Can I do it? Yes, you can, and I'm going to show you how to do it. And it works for the Rickrack, it works for any of those dies. So for example, the scallop border, this method will also work. So what you're going to do first of all is you're going to get a piece of plain white paper. Now I am always saying don't use your dies to cut paper, only use them to cut fabric. We're going to cut one piece of fabric once, okay? It's allowed, all right? A minimal amount of paper is okay. Just don't use it routinely for cutting paper. So we're going to pass that through the Go Big and cut the Rickrack out of paper. Okay, so we've got that cut. And you could also do this from something like non-woven medium weight interfacing, and that will create a template which is a little bit more durable and long lasting than paper. So you can see there what I've done is I've cut out the Rickrack in paper. Now I'm interested in the 4-inch wide Rickrack for now, so we'll just have a look at that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold the Rickrack in half, and what I want to do is I want to line up the hill with the hill. So I've got a hill and a valley, and I want to line this hill and this hill up with each other as perfectly as I possibly can, and then I'm going to form a crease in the paper, and that crease in the paper is slap bang in the middle of that valley. Okay, so keep it folded like that, and then you're going to lay this piece of paper back onto your die, and you're going to match up the hills and the valleys with the blades on your die. And then what you need to do is grab a chalk pencil. So I've got my Soline chalk pencil here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that folded edge, and I'm going to draw a line straight across the die. Now I like to use a chalk pencil because then I can rub the mark away, but you could use something like a Sharpie pen, a fine Sharpie, and can you see just about a line that runs across the die now, just in chalk. Brilliant. Now we've got a visual reference for our fabric. So let's grab a piece of fabric, and what I'm going to do, this is full width of fabric, folded in half, and I'm going to line that fold up against the chalk line, or just a thread behind it. Pop our mat back on top and cut. So your die is 24 inches long, but if we want to cut longer pieces of Rickrack, this is the way to do it. It's easy and it works. So once the die has gone through, our Rickrack is now cut. I can slide my mat off, and look now, when I open it out, I've now got a long length of Rickrack. You can just about see the fold in the middle, but what we've got is a continuous Rickrack, so I could just keep doing that. And if I wanted 90 inches of Rickrack, all I would do is put a chalk mark at the top of my die and one at the bottom, and then fold between the two lines. So that's how you're going to use your Rickrack die or your scallop die to cut continuous Rickrack. So I hope you've enjoyed today's class on borders for your quilts. We've looked at straight borders, plain borders, adding cornerstones, piece borders using your cube, and also some applique borders. There's so much that you can do using your AccuQuilt. We go way beyond the blocks. So make sure you join me every time we post a new video, and if you sign up to our YouTube video, then you'll get notification every time we bring out a new video. Make sure you subscribe. Thanks for watching this tutorial brought to you by AccuQuilt and Create and Craft. See you next time.